Good morning. Good morning, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, moderators and speakers, dear participants of the second Eumigro conference. It's my pleasure to welcome you today on the occasion of the event we held at the Warsaw School of Economics for the second time. The title of today's conference is Migration and Refugee Crisis, the EU and its member states between obligations, self-interest and goodwill. The conference is organized by the Department of Political Studies of the Collegium of Socioeconomics at the Warsaw School of Economics, in cooperation with Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Poland, and in cooperation with more than 20 different partners. It's my pleasure also to inform you that the European Commission representation in Poland has granted its honorary patronage to this event. During today's conference, there will be two keynote speeches by special guests, by Professor Petra Bendel from Germany and by Professor Magdalena Kmak from Finland. These two keynote speeches will be followed by 4 expert panels with the participation of representatives of domestic and foreign universities, public institutions, as well as international and non-governmental organizations. The conference is organized within the framework of the project Eumigro, what stands for its full name, Jean Monnet Module on the European Union and the Contemporary International Migration and Interdisciplinary Approach. This project, Eumigro, is conducted at the Warsaw School of Economics in the years 2016-2019 and co-financed by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union. The main objective of the project itself is an inclusive, open, multi-level, multi-sectoral, interdisciplinary and intergenerational academic discussion and popularization of reliable and up-to-date knowledge in the field of migration, asylum, borders, refugee issues, and integration issues, especially in the EU and European contexts. It's my pleasure to introduce now our special guests that will officially open today's conference. So let me present Professor Krzysztof Kozłowski, Vice Rector for Teaching and Student Affairs of the Warsaw School of Economics, but at the same time Head of the Department of Political Studies. So I have a pleasure to be a member of his department's team. Then I would like to introduce Professor Wojciech Morawski, Dean of the Collegium of Socioeconomics of the Warsaw School of Economics. And I would like to introduce Mr. Piotr Womela, that represents today the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Poland, so our main co-organizer of the event. So now I would like to offer you the floor and ask you for a short introduction to our official event. The floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Warsaw School of Economics. It's always a pleasure to open such events, to participate in such projects. As Marta has already mentioned, I'm here in kind of 2 roles. This is not schizophrenic, don't worry. Actually, at one point, to a certain extent, I'm supporting this as a Vice Rector for Student and Teaching Affairs. As I see some of the students in the audience, I'm very happy that actually this university gives you an opportunity to take a peek into the most recent developments in science and academic analysis. On the other hand, as a head of the Political Studies Department, I'm very happy to help actually, because from my perspective, the head of the project is obviously Marta. I'm very happy to help her with this project. I'm very happy to see you here. I'm very happy that actually this project has met with such an interest. And of course, whenever we are talking about migration and refugee crisis, obligation, self-interest and goodwill, it's hard not to throw a few words into a discussion. From my perspective, actually, the most interesting aspect of this problem is the question of responsibility. Migration crisis actually is slowly coming to an end. The migration as such is a natural phenomenon which we have witnessed for centuries, which we have witnessed in certain form of an apex within the last few years. Probably we shall be witnessing in the future. The question is, have we learned anything from it? Have we noticed certain patterns? Have we noticed something in ourselves, in European societies, that surprised quite a lot of us, actually? I believe that quite many of us believed that some questions have already been answered several years ago. And all these discussions seem to be reopened suddenly, and I'm wondering whether they are finished. They have came to some sort of proactive, positive conclusions. Thereby, even more, I'm interested in your developments within this project, within today's event. I'm looking forward to the conclusions, and I wish you all fruitful discussions. And Marta, thank you very much again for such an initiative. The co-organizers, the co-funders, thank you very much for coming here, for participating in this with us, for helping this to happen. Thank you very much, and I wish you a fruitful discussion, a fruitful event. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to welcome you at the Migration Conference. Migration crisis is a very serious challenge for the European societies, not only because of its size, but also because we have no idea how to come out of it. In my opinion, the main problem is that migration crisis is connected with general crisis of identity determined by the process of globalization. In such situation, the nationalism and xenophobic attitude have become dangerously attractive. That is why the issues that are going to be discussed are very serious and great importance. I hope this conference will contribute to deeper understanding of the problem. Thank you very much.
First of all, I would like to welcome all of you to this conference, which is co-organized by the Konrad Adenauer Foundation here in Poland. And I'm very glad that our foundation is participating in this very important event. Unfortunately, Mrs. Angelika Klein, the director of the Polish office of our foundation, was not able to join our conference due to other duties. She asked me to represent the Adenauer Foundation. The Konrad Adenauer Foundation is a German institution, a German political foundation, which provides political counseling. Ideologically, we stand for Christian democratic values. We have been operating in Poland since 1989. And from the very beginning on, we supported the democratic transition of communist countries in Europe. Now we focus our work on the quality of democracy, civil society, and international dialogue. In Poland, the foundation carries out more than 100 projects a year. The topic of today's conference is a very interesting one and in line with the current priorities of the Adenauer Foundation. Our activities are focused on strengthening the European Union, the European integration, and on conducting analysis concerning complex processes taking place within the European Union. The refugee or migration crisis was and still is one of the biggest challenges that we as a union have to handle. The Adenauer Foundation tries to enable a free exchange of views and to open the floor for different opinions, just as we are doing it with our conference today. I'm very glad that we managed to gather such a prominent group of experts at the conference today. At this point, I would like to express my gratitude to the speakers for being here today. I would also like to thank the Warsaw School of Economics for the hospitality and all our partners for organizing our meeting. Last but not least, I would like to thank Marta Pachocka for the excellent cooperation, as usual, and substantive support. I wish you a fruitful debate. Thank you very much.
So let me thank you, all of you, for this official but very, very friendly opening of our conference. I just would like to mention all partners that are involved in our event. Even some of them provided us with their roll-ups, so you can see them. But really, we are very grateful that on the occasion of this conference, we were able to invite and involved to this activity so many great institutions. And these are not only academic institutions or universities. These are also non-governmental organizations dealing with migration and refugee issues. These are also representations of different international organizations, including the EU. So let me briefly read the list of our partners. Obviously, you can see it on your programs. Association for Legal Intervention, Poland. Center for Europe, University of Warsaw, Poland. Center for Innovative Research Across the Life Course, Coventry University, United Kingdom. Center of Excellence in Law, Identity and the European Narratives, University of Helsinki, Finland. Center of Migration Research of the University of Warsaw, Poland. DERE, the American College of Greece. European Border and Coast Guard Agency, well known as Frontex. Faculty of Administration and National Security of the Jakob of Paradis University in Gorzów Wielkopolski, Poland. Friedrich Alexander Universität Erlangen-Nuremberg, Germany. Institute for Migration Research and Intercultural Studies of the University of Osnabrück, Germany. German Network of Refugee Researchers, Germany. Institute of East Central Europe from Poland. Institute of International Studies of the University of Wrocław, Poland. Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński University in Warsaw, Poland. Institute of Social Prevention and Resocialization of the University of Warsaw, Poland. International and European Law Department of the National University in Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, Ukraine. Jean Monnet Center of Excellence of the Warsaw School of Economics, Poland. 2 Jean Monnet modules, BNU from Greece and EUINXO from Poland. Minority Research Profile of the Abo Academy University in Turku, Finland. Polish European Community Studies Association from Poland and Warsaw Family Support Center from Poland. So once again, many thanks to you. We very appreciate your presence, your involvement in different ways as speakers, as moderators, or simply as our dear audience and hopefully those that will ask smart questions in the end. So just to join the words expressed by our professors and Mr. Womela, also I would like to wish us fruitful discussions and many inspiring speeches. So now I would like to invite you to the first part of our conference. We will have 2 keynote speeches. The first one will be delivered by Professor Petra Bendel, Friedrich Alexander Universität Erlangen-Nuremberg, Chair of the Advisory Council of the Federal Office of Migration and Refugees, and member of the Expert Council of German Foundations for Integration and Migration. Professor Petra Bendel will give us a speech titled Current EU Refugee Policies, and this speech will be followed by the second keynote speech by Professor Magdalena Kmak from Finland, Minority Research Profile, Abo Academy University in Turku, and Center of Excellence at the University of Helsinki, and the title of her speech will be The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly of the EU Migration Management in Times of Crisis. So, firstly, I would like to invite Professor Petra Bendel. You will have 25 minutes, and then we will invite directly Professor Magdalena Kmak.
Thank you very much, Marta. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you here today. Indeed, I think this is a very good moment to exchange ideas on these topics, and I very much appreciate the initiative of the Warsaw School of Economics, the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, the Commission, and all the other partners involved here in organizing this important event. My objective in the following is to differentiate between different types of refugee policy in Europe, and on the basis of these, to identify current trends. I shall then determine possible policy actions for the future which result from them. Although my tentative typology is initially an empirical one, I do not wish to sidestep making an explicitly political normative statement also, and in doing so, it is the human rights and the rights of refugees that constitute my normative compass. Enshrined in positive law, the challenges of migration management and refugee and integration policy can be interpreted and addressed productively, I think, since the European Union generally refers to human rights. These can be seen as the core theme when it comes to developing standards for future action. These standards concern all the central topics addressed at this conference. They concern a future migration foreign policy as regards the cooperation with countries of origin and transit countries, and policies at the external borders, which, in my opinion, lead to one of the most important research questions in both law and social sciences, that is, the question as to where human rights apply. They equally affect actions within the European Union as regards the no less crucial questions, how refugees and migrants should be treated once we have received them, and consequently, also questions concerning the revising of a common European asylum system. Finally, they also concern the question of integration, since human rights always serve as the basis for a continual discursive struggle when it comes to the interpretation of how flight, migration, and integration should be classified. Ultimately, in my opinion, they serve as a basis for the affirmation of cultural pluralization of the immigration society. In their economic, social, and cultural alternative, the human rights form the rights-based foundation for participation with equal opportunities for everyone. So let's begin with the empirical analysis, at the same time bearing in mind this normative compass. In order to determine the development of refugee, migration, and integration policies within the EU, I will address three issues. First, what, according to each member state, should a migration policy look like? Second, where do the member states stand on the question of solidarity and shared responsibility among the member states, and what is the position of the member states in respect to those standards already set by the common European asylum system? And third, what does their integration policy look like? And from this, I think we can tentatively develop or identify four types which could be placed on a continuum also. A continuum would indeed indicate even better that the distinction between the four groups I'm going to mention is not quite clear-cut, that there is rather quite a lot happening between them, and these dynamics are exactly what will determine in which direction the refugee policy in Europe is moving. As such, I do not wish these four types to be understood as wholly exclusive of each other, but rather as types which can also overlap, and the actions of which are in a state of flux. Despite all the differences, all four types have one unfortunately, rather negative tendency in common, and that is a trend towards a restrictive policy at the expense of human and refugee rights. Allow me to briefly present these to you and to illustrate them by means of some current developments in some member states. Group 1, states along the southern external borders, without solidarity for more border control, extraterritorial asylum procedures, and detention. The first group then compromises the states along the external borders of the EU, in particular Italy and Greece, but also Cyprus, Malta, and to a certain extent Spain. Their main interest in the past few years has been to push for more shared responsibility in the EU. It is these countries which, as hubs and with the hotspot approach, should have ensured the establishing of permanent solutions, acceptance, relocation, or return of migrants and refugees. Due to a lack of administrative competence, a lack of willingness to receive on the part of other EU member states, and also a lack of trust on the part of many refugees themselves, it was not possible, however, to impose this hotspot approach within the time frame and to the extent intended. The result was considerable human rights problems, especially in the reception areas, fewer guarantees in the asylum process, undetermined responsibility on the European or national level, highly questionable living conditions, and even detention in the reception centers. Even in Italy before the last elections, there has been a trend towards the tightening of the refugee and migration policy. In early 2017, the country extended its practice of detaining refugees by way of the Minniti decree. Reception and repatriation centers were expanded and extended, with those seeking asylum being taken into custody before being repatriated. Italy has also simplified and expedited the process of recognizing asylum seekers, and in doing so, casually removed the legal possibility of appealing to the next instance entirely. Human rights organizations such as Coalizione Italiana Libertà e Diritti Civili have quite rightly condemned the fact that there must no longer be individual hearings in person, something which is clearly in breach of European law pursuant to the Asylum Procedures Directive. The large proportion of refugees these countries received and the disappointment at the lack of solidarity in Europe are the reasons for this policy orientation. What is more, especially in the hotspot states, public opinion has seen a notable shift towards populist parties and of various origins, such as we know in Italy the Movimento 5 Stelle or Lega Nord and Forza Italia. Conservative governed Spain, in which in contrast there are no right-wing parties, at least on the national level, is geographically further away from the main countries of origin over the past few years than Greece or Italy. Nevertheless, at the time confronted with a considerable number of arrivals to the Canary Islands, already under the previous socialist government, Zapatero, Spain relied on bilateral cooperation with the countries of origin by way of repatriation agreements, specifically with Morocco, as well as with the whole of West Africa. For a long time, it has relied on border controls in African waters and the martial isolation of its exclaves Ceuta and Melilla, situated on Moroccan territory. In this way, with its Plan Africa, adopted already in 2006, Spain established itself as a forerunner of an externalized refugee policy under the mantle of development cooperation as compensation for cooperation on migration control. In return for the prevention of illegal entry and the monitoring of the sea, it approved the normal entry of and the issuing of work permits for a certain number of migrants, a strategy which has now become the blueprint for the whole of Europe in the form of the new migration partnerships. Second group, outward restrictions, inward integration, but with a declining tendency. France's President Macron also recently took a similar position as a fervent proponent of a greater externalization of EU refugee policy, in particular, in respect of extraterritorial asylum procedures. This is certainly not a new idea, but rather dates back to the new vision for refugees and reception camps in Africa, already proposed by Tony Blair in 2003, and a year later by German Minister Otto Schily. Now also Macron has announced pre-screening for the asylum process, which is already to take place in Chad and Niger. With regard to the eternal EU refugee policy, France is one of the countries which advocates a two-speed Europe, potentially shoulder to shoulder with Germany. In addition, last month, Macron bilaterally signed a new refugee agreement with the United Kingdom, which, amongst other things, provided for an enhanced police cooperation to control the border in Calais. With regard to solidarity with the member states, with a total of 156,000 applications in 2 years, France was most recently only in 5th place in terms of the number of refugees received, far behind Germany, Italy, Hungary, or Sweden. However, the country has tended to receive an increasing number of immigrants from Africa, and in 2017 passed the 100,000 mark, which resulted in the country introducing harsher controls on immigration. The French integration policy, conversely, was, and up to now still is, characterized by precarious accommodation, long processing times for asylum applications, and hardly any provisions for integration. According to the current projet de loi, asylum procedures should also become faster in France, and those who are to be deported should be able to be held for longer in deportation and detention centers. However, in the new bill, efforts are being made for the first time to improve integration policy also, in part based on the German model, as I was able to see for myself last month in the National Assembly. Macron calls this balancing act a combination of humanity and hardship. If we are saying that the members of this second group then have in common a coordinated migration foreign policy in Europe, an active repatriation policy, and an active integration policy, then besides France, we must also include Portugal, Luxembourg, recently Finland and Sweden, and up to now Germany. Sweden, for example, for a long time an important ally of Germany in respect of the refugee issue, and which argued in favor of European solutions and binding distribution quotas, is reacting to an increased approval of the Sweden Democrats and an increasing polarization of public opinion with limitations. Whereas, on the one hand, attempts have been made to make Sweden less attractive, on the other hand, a number of initiatives and projects have been launched with the aim of better integration and quicker inclusion in the labor market. How much longer Germany will be a part of this group will depend on the new government. We have one, at least, not finally. With the Integration Act in force since 2016, we have been able to establish an initial improvement also in Germany with regard to integration into the labor market, especially as regards the integration conditions for labor market skills. However, if we follow the results of the coalition agreement, and I'm sorry to criticize the new government, when it has hardly started to work, but we can identify many areas with a notably restrictive tendency also. The parents of young persons granted subsidiary protection, for instance, may not be granted entry subsequently. The restrictions on family reunion in general aims at making integration more difficult in just the same way as accommodation in the new central reception, decision-making and repatriation centers called Anker institutions in German. Instead of broadly interpreting the right to family and the welfare of children in family reunion, the present coalition partners are focusing on quotas. Instead of ensuring access to the right to education for all children and young people as early and comprehensively as possible in the new Anker institutions, which we know in Bavaria only too well, access to important integration provision is limited intentionally. With regard to the common EU refugee policy in the years 2015 and 2016, the second group was still characterized as having a certain amount of willingness to relieve the states on the external boundaries of the EU through relocation, so the states of the first group. This policy of European solidarity and shared responsibility has been revoked at the latest following the results of the German coalition agreement, though not because of them. In the Europe section of the exploratory negotiation results, the Grand Coalition partners promote a Europe of democracy and solidarity, but at the same time they are sending out, from a European policy perspective, rather counterproductive message that they intend to stop the reception program for refugees from Italy and Greece. The second group then, which traditionally stood for a rather more advanced European refugee policy, where necessary at 2 or more speeds, and which even in 2016 called itself the Coalition of the Willing, is visibly disintegrating following the latest changes in government, in particular in Austria. What remains is the small, traditionally migration-friendly Luxembourg, with its share of refugees based on its population size, placing it at the top of the scale in Europe, with a consensus across the political divide not to set any upper limits or caps and to continue to strive for European solutions. A consensus across party lines to receive larger numbers of refugees than is provided for by EU rules also exists in Portugal, which is only marginally affected by refugee immigration. The lack of a right-wing populist or right-wing extremist party and a positive political tradition in dealing with immigration are quite obviously important variables when it comes to explaining the openness of just these 2 small countries. Third group, tightening of refugee and integration policies, discontinuance of European solidarity. Since the recent right-wing conservative, right-wing populist change in government, Austria, on the other hand, stands for a tougher both refugee and integration policy. The European Republic is in a group together with all those conservative or conservative liberal governed countries which have already denounced European solidarity and shared responsibility, noticeably focus on securing the borders and for fear of further pull factors are also simply restricting the integration of refugees. You will already have noticed that this group is visibly filling up to come back to the image of the initial image of the continuum. Besides Austria, it also includes Belgium under its right-wing liberal government coalition, the conservative liberal governed Netherlands with its bed, bath and bread accommodation policy, and until the collapse of the government coalition, Finland with the True Finns. Recently, also center-right governed Denmark has joined this group, a country which has anyway gradually been introducing tougher asylum laws since the 1990s and again in the 2000s. Restrictions on family reunion, shorter residence permit, and benefit cuts are all components of a hard line in Danish politics, which are almost certainly in part attributable to a noticeably divided public opinion and the influence of the Danish People's Party as the second strongest party in parliament and which for the second time is functioning as a parliamentary majority provider for a conservative liberal minority government. Fourth group, zero immigration, zero integration, zero solidarity. As you will no doubt have expected, the fourth group consists of those states, with the exception of the Czech Republic, which are located on the eastern external borders, the nationalist, conservative to populist governed and EU skeptical states Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. These oppose common European solutions and sometimes resorting to the courts refuse to receive refugees, very few of them of whom they have accepted in any case. Indeed, most of those who were accepted have already left these member states again. The trend is towards a policy of border control or closure. An integration policy is at best in operation in respect to specific groups of immigrants, for example, from Ukraine, but is otherwise rejected as a potential pull factor. 3 months before parliamentary elections, on the 8th of April, the Hungarian government has even gone as far as to threaten to impose tax on refugees organizations whose revenues come mostly from abroad. And this includes almost all Hungarian human rights and asylum aid organizations which look after refugees. Common to the countries in this group is the fact that they have hardly any tradition when it comes to dealing with immigration, in particular immigration from Muslim countries, and a little developed awareness of human rights aspects of refugee policy. Besides the geographical location, it is above all the ideological orientation of the government and the role of populist parties in the party spectrum, which have proven to be responsible as an explanatory variable for the different axes in European policy. The political tradition, when it comes to dealing with flight and immigration, is also an important predictor for refugee policy, as well as for the development of public opinion and the development of discourse. Ultimately, we are observing considerable polarizations and heated debates on identity, as you already mentioned in the beginning, almost everywhere in Europe, which are coupled with a notable EU skepticism in the Visegrad countries. In light of the considerable differences in the Council regarding the newly revised common European asylum system, which have become more than clear both in December at the summit in Brussels and again in January in Sofia, it is doubtful whether the current Bulgarian presidency will manage to marry the differences between Western and Eastern Europe and build a bridge to Turkey before Austria takes over the Council presidency in the second half of the year. There is much to suggest that Austria, and therefore the image of a continuum, could even position itself at the head of the Visegrad countries. Which trends result from this for a future EU refugee policy, and how should these be evaluated in terms of human rights? Allow me just to point out a few aspects and to be normative and political on that. Europe is in danger of losing its soul by means of refugee policy. This is how a dossier of Janis Brühl on migration from Africa in January this year ended. Another quote, yes, the number of refugees in Germany and Europe is declining. However, we should not deceive ourselves. Europe has sold its soul for this, was also Georg Restler commenting in January in the German news program Tagesschau. Hidden behind these admittedly dramatic statements are, in my view, four quite fitting analyses. These have proved to me, firstly, that European refugee policy is noticeably split along the lines of national and group interests, and as such departs from the principles of solidarity and shared responsibility. Secondly, that the European member states are visibly operating a policy of externalization of the responsibility to protect. The deal with the devil involves alliances with powers which are contrary to the objectives and ideals in respect of human and refugee rights. And thirdly, European refugee policy threatens to dilute the EU's own human rights and refugee rights standards, which at one time had been agreed on. Finally, what is necessary for the application of human rights standards, instead of preventing integration, is clearly committing to it. As the German migration scholar Klaus Bade once put it, integration policies should provide all people with the opportunity to participate with their individual skills and talents by mobilizing their abilities, but also through their cultures and dreams of a better life. What can we do? Ladies and gentlemen, the very reason why for many refugees Europe has become a place of longing for freedom is because it invokes human dignity and human rights. What is in danger are the rights of migrants and refugees to non-refoulement at the borders, the right to freedom of movement through detention, the question of the recognition of their status within Europe, their economic, social, and cultural rights, the right to live together as a family, and rights in connection with the asylum process. Whilst the human rights, on the one hand, provide a normative orientation for dealing with plurality and differences in modern society, on the other hand, they find themselves at the center of ongoing controversies in the context of the current crisis in individual member states, but also the crisis of solidarity among the member states. The human rights are noticeably called into question, and their assertion faces opposition with the wind blowing increasingly harder in the faces of those who defend human and refugee rights. Yet it is us, students of migration and integration policy, academic representatives and those representing think tanks, civil society, interpreters of law and cause lawyers, who, as advocates of human and refugee rights in research, academic policy consultation, and practice, further develop these human rights. And we do so by way of forum shopping on various political levels and in the various arenas. Be it constantly checking whether or not it is correct when European governments refer to allegedly legal vacuums when it comes to the application of human rights in third countries. Be it by investigating how the extraterritorial application of human rights can continue to develop in public international law. We are the ones who advocate national and international mechanisms for the controlling of standards which reveal and denounce gaps in protection. We are the ones who disclose, expose, and have influence on the current political discourse. Those who work out the possibilities for solidarity and fair distribution. We are the ones who will hopefully continue to object when, instead of integration and instead of equal participation, exclusion and discrimination become widespread. Human rights, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, have always developed, especially in times of crisis and upheaval, and in particular in the context of conflictual, pluralizing, and differentiating societies. That is perhaps the only optimistic counterpoint of my otherwise rather pessimistic insights into the topic of migration in Europe. And it is also the basis for the future credibility of Europe in the development of a global refugee and migration regime. We need to stay on the ball. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, before I start my keynote address, please let me express my gratitude to Marta for inviting me to speak at this important conference, and to the organizing institutions and organizing and supporting institutions for making this conference happen. Also, thank you so much, Petra, for your insightful presentation. Finally, I'm also particularly honored to speak in my home country and in the city I have lived for a number of years and I feel very much connected to. At the same time, addressing the challenge migration is posing to the European Union and to its member states, it is very important precisely here in Poland, which, and I'm really sorry to say so, has over the last couple of years turned its back on both the EU with its idea of solidarity and burden sharing, and more broadly, its obligation deriving from the EU membership. Even though Poland's approach cannot be considered symptomatic of the whole, of the general EU and member states' approaches, and as Petra has already mentioned today, the narrative of crisis and the politics of fear, which is linked with it, corresponds with many similar voices in other EU member states and has been effectively used for many politicians to rise to power. In this keynote address, I would like to reflect on the topic of this conference. I would like to focus on two things. First, on the concept of migration and refugee crisis itself, and secondly, on what is indeed happening as a topic of the conference indicates in between obligations, self-interest, and goodwill in the European Union and member states. It is therefore the concept of migration crisis that I would like to reflect on before I move to the main topic of my presentation. In that sense, I am challenging the premise of today's conference, and I'm really sorry for organizing to do so. It's not a hostile challenge. But what I want to say is what we are dealing here with, it's not really, question is it really a refugee crisis? And Thomas Spijkerboer, a professor at Free University of Amsterdam, in his, I'm sure, already very famous blog post, Europe's Refugee Crisis, A Perfect Storm, diagnosed the 2015 situation as an accumulation of number of symptoms, situations and problems that has been known for a long time, but haven't been effectively addressed on both international, European, and local levels. So let me go briefly through those symptoms. First, the major refugee crisis, in particular, conflict in Syria that has developed from 2011, which forced a greater part of the population to flee. Second, the serious underfunding. Funding for hosting Syrian refugees in the region has been seriously limited. Third, minimal resettlement. And as Spike Boas says, the resettlement of Syrian refugees in other parts of the world, crucially in order to enable especially Lebanon to host Syrian refugees, is not really occurring or hasn't been occurring on the scale of any significance. Fourth, the prohibition of travel. Many states have prohibited Syrians to travel, making it impossible for them to leave Syria or the overabundant refugee camps in the region. In particular, many of the neighboring countries have introduced visas to Syrians in response to the European pressure. Then, intended ripple effects. By prohibiting refugees from entering the EU and encouraging neighboring countries to prohibit refugees entering their countries, the European Union has intentionally made it illegal and therefore very difficult for many Syrian refugees to leave their own country in order to seek the protection they need and to which they are entitled. 6, common European asylum system fails. The quality of asylum procedures ranges from near perfect to nearly non-existent. European asylum law has little common and there is not really a system to it. 7, systematic underestimation. The Syrian conflict has been building up for a couple of years, and refugees started to leave a country in the significant numbers in 2012. The lack of preparation, not enough reception facilities, insufficient immigration officers, and so on, created the idea that the numbers are more than the EU can handle. And finally, exploitation of problems. And as Petra has been mentioning, almost every European country has prominent politicians successfully profiteering from the problem that has been accompanying the influx of refugees. Mainstream parties have been mimicking the xenophobic rhetorics of wars, adopting them directly, and therefore undermining support for sheltering refugees, using the politics of fear to get political support. And of course, that's a diagnosis from 2016. Things have happened, but I think we still can build on what Spike Boer has been saying to diagnose the situation not really as a refugee and migration crisis, but what others has already today been saying as a different crisis. Perhaps a crisis of idea of European solidarity, or simply a crisis of European values, and I'm agreeing here with Professor Morawski's opening words. At the same time, I'm definitely agreeing with organizers that the crisis is stemming from the conflict between obligations and interests of both the EU and the member states. And let me then focus on the second part of my presentation. Martin Scheinin, former long-term director of my current academic home, Obu Academy Institutes for Human Rights, as well as former UN rapporteur on human rights and terrorism, has once said that human rights are obligatory nuisance for states, who on the one hand feel obliged to implement them, but on the other wouldn't really like to do so, as they consider human rights as clashing with their different interests. My former boss, head of the Erik Castren Institute of International Law and Human Rights at the University of Helsinki, and the main person behind so-called Helsinki School of International Law, Martti Koskeniemi, would respond that human rights themselves constitute part of the problem, if you will. Indeterminacy of the international legal concepts and the circularity of the international legal argument presuppose the impossibility of their implementation. The views that nation-states either do not want to limit their sovereignty in face of the human rights obligations, or that human rights are a necessary element of state sovereignty, even though theoretically inconsistent, in practice lead to similar outcome. And the impossibility of having human rights fully followed and implemented. And there is no better example of this problem as the matter of migration, in particular refugee protection. For, as Giorgio Agamben famously stated, the refugee constitutes a limit concept of the nation-state. According to Agamben, and I quote, "If the refugee represents such a disquieting element in the order of the nation-state, this is so primarily because, by breaking the identity between the human and the citizen, and that between nativity and nationality, it brings the originary friction of sovereignty to crisis. Catherine Daverney illustrates that the situation more concretely in relation to the international legal obligations, saying that it is indeed international law, the Refugee Convention, that is creating this crisis. And I quote, "The asylum crisis arises because there are many more people in the world entitled to asylum than Western industrialized countries want to welcome as refugees. The central strategy is to ensure that asylum seekers do not arrive in the first place, because once a person is on national territory, policy options dwindle." In order to illustrate better this problem of conflicting approaches to foreigners in the European Union, in particular the approaches of both the EU and the member states to asylum seekers and refugees in times of so-called refugee crisis, I wanted to refer in this presentation to Sergio Leone's famous 1966 movie titled The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. In this categorization, and I'm presenting my kind of understanding of how migrants are being portrayed, the good comprise EU citizens and their family members benefiting from the right of freedom of movement, and also academics, students, long-term residents, and highly skilled third country nationals entering the EU for the purpose of work. These foreigners belong to a privileged group of EU citizens and economically beneficial third country nationals for whom special legal status available in simplified procedures has been designed in the EU law. The bad, on the other hand, refers to immigrants who are perceived as those abusing the EU and national legislations, constituting a security threat or negatively affecting the economy. The EU laws often do not provide effective human rights protection to this group of immigrants, but rather focus on both preventing their entry and their effective removal from common territory. One of the examples is, in my opinion, the long-term detention for the purpose of removal as allowed in the Returns Directive. Finally, the focus on my presentation, the ugly, refer to asylum seekers or other foreigners towards whom, and I've forgotten to do that, towards whom states, EU and member states have international human rights obligations. We can see that the EU and national laws regulating the right to entry and residence of this group of foreigners reflect the existing conflict between human rights obligations and states' preferences regarding the design of the immigration policies. States juxtapose their obligation to provide protection to those seeking asylum with their preferences based on a number of interests, including economic, social, or security ones. In consequence, states often treat asylum seekers as economic migrants, offenders, terrorists, or bogus asylum seekers, and as I call them, the ugly. And before I refer to concrete examples of legal regulations that support this approach, I would like to focus for a while on what I call the philosophy behind the ugly. For the ugly constitute an embodiment of Schining's obligatory nuisance, the subject that is neither good nor bad, at the same time protected and unprotected. In other words, a fragmented subject. I believe that the process of management of migrants seeking protection in the European Union, based on the conflict between the aims of states to control external borders and movement of asylum seekers in the common area, and states' obligations deriving from 1951 Refugee Convention and other human rights instruments, happens through fragmentation of refugee subjectivity. In other words, their positionality in relation to power into bogus asylum seeker and genuine refugee. The focus on a particular aspect of the conflict, protection of security and state sovereignty on the one hand, and protection of rights on the other, produces, as Sandra Mesandra and Brett Nelson calls it, a fragmented subject, or some double-faced subjects or genus subject. Whereas the need to respect human rights obligations produces a genuine refugee, the need to control external borders and impose limitation on those coming to the EU produces its necessary counterpart, the bogus asylum seeker. Such fragmented subject is an expected outcome of a nation-state system. The term bogus asylum seeker, together with concepts such as queue jumper or asylum shopper, has been firmly embedded in European migration discourses since 1990s. As pointed out by Monica de Boer, its use in relation to those lodging clearly unjustified asylum applications represents the belief, widespread among migration authorities, that bogus asylum seekers form the greatest proportions of asylum seekers. Analysis of the origins of the concept helps to understand the rationality behind its introduction. The UK was one of the first countries to introduce the term bogus asylum seeker into its national policy. According to Bridget Anderson, the term was used for the first time in relation to asylum seekers in a policy document presented to the British Parliament in 1998 entitled Fairer, Faster and Firmer, a modern approach to migration and asylum. The document aimed to respond to seemingly the most pressing problem of asylum policies of the time: how to design and run an asylum system which would be able to support genuine asylum seekers and deter claimants who abuse the law. In consequence, the document made the government's obligation to provide the asylum seeker with a fair and fast procedure dependent on the behavior of asylum seeker. And I quote, in return, applicants will be expected clearly to recognize their obligations, including to tell the truth about their circumstances, obey the law, keep in regular contact with the authorities considering their claim, and leave the country if the application is ultimately rejected. Our revision of asylum procedure is based on this recognition of mutual obligation, a new covenant, end of quote. These formulations show how the document introduced a form of contract between the British state and asylum seekers in which the promise of protection, shelter, and quick procedure depended on their proper behavior. Those who did not behave in an expected manner, so those who lied, avoided the authorities, and remained in the country after a negative decision was issued in their case, were considered to be bogus asylum seekers. Interestingly, the policy document, by the use of terminology referring to social contract between the state and the asylum seeker, and I quote, with its neoliberal emphasis on personal responsibility and government accountability, end of quote, implied that the authorities are dealing with a rational and reasonable person who understands her situation and is aware of consequences of her behavior. This rationality also implied the moral nature of those asylum seekers who want to have their rights guaranteed by the British state. Bogus asylum seekers, due to their moral flaws, were those who broke the contract and therefore did not deserve protection. The idea that bogus asylum seekers form the majority of persons applying for asylum also dominates in current discourses. For instance, in the European Commission's opinion, expressed in 2001 Communication on Migration, most of those trying to enter EU following the Arab Spring revolutions were not genuine refugees. And I quote, more than 20,000 migrants, mainly from Tunisia and to a lesser extent from other African countries, have managed to enter the EU irregularly, reaching the shores of Italy and Malta, both of which are under strong migratory pressures. Most of these are economic migrants should be returned to the countries of origin, end of quote. Even though the Commission confirmed that a considerable number of those migrants were refugees from other African countries such as Somalia, Eritrea, or Sudan, it nevertheless seemed to associate all those entering EU irregularly with economic migration, and I quote, "It is important to differentiate between irregular migrants, meaning economic migrants trying to cross EU border illegally, refugees or persons who might seek asylum, and people who are temporarily displaced, such as foreign workers in Libya driven out by the conflict and wishing to move back to their country of origin. The legal status of these people, as well as the help the EU can provide them, is different," end of quote. In addition, the Commission's claim that there is a need to ensure, and I quote, "the right balance between enhanced mobility of bona fide travelers and the risks of irregular migration," end of quote, clearly suggests that those coming to the EU in an irregular manner are not perceived as traveling bona fide. which implies their immorality. This happens even though, as we have seen, the EU also produced these economic migrants, but making application for protection in a regular manner very difficult. On the other hand, of the process of fragmentation of refugee subjectivity lies the genuine refugee, whose subjectivation happens not through security-enhanced laws, but through human rights laws. Since the aim of human rights, which derive from the dignity of the human person, is not enhancement of human agency, but protection of the individual, the subject produced by human rights is not an active individual, but rather a helpless victim. According to Urene Urenia, international human rights law, and I quote, frames human beings as passive entities who require outside aid to mobilize, end of quote. Because the obligation to grant protection to refugees derives from the human rights obligations of states and the EU, the genuine refugee produced by such law has to fit into the idea of passive individual devoid of agency and autonomy. In consequence of this idea of passivity and victimization of genuine refugees, states are able to limit protection only to small numbers of the most vulnerable and traumatized refugees. These two figures, the bogus asylum seeker and the genuine refugee, constitutes two faces of fragmented refugee subject. They remain interrelated and dependent on one another. On the one hand, the asylum seeker, in order to be considered as deserving international protection, must fit into the passive and victimized narrative defined by the subjectivity of the genuine asylum seeker. Those who do not fit into this narrative may not be recognized as refugees, even though they might have a genuine basis for protection. In turn, since EU laws significantly limit the possibility of an asylum seeker to enter EU territory in a regular manner and does not grant effective possibilities to seek asylum in other ways, those in need of protection are forced to use irregular migration channels and to present themselves in a manner fitting into the victimization narrative. In consequence, any display of agency and adjustments made by asylum seekers in their stories in order to receive refugee status portray them as liars or opportunists and therefore bogus asylum seekers, justifying existing fears connected with migration. We can therefore see how EU law treats an asylum seeker as a rational and calculating subject, and in consequence aims to modify their behavior by adopting laws which would make regular entry and residence in the EU difficult. This, however, does not stop asylum seekers who instead choose to use irregular ways of entering the EU territory and present themselves in order to fit the expectations of governments. This, in turn, triggers the process of subjectivation of protection seekers as bogus asylum seekers, through juxtaposing them to the idea of genuine refugee, who does not use irregular migration channels, but waits patiently to be brought to the EU through a resettlement process. Then the member state closed the circle of subjectivation by adopting stricter asylum measures, aiming to limit entry of protection seekers into the EU territory. In short, as pointed by Catherine Daverny, and I quote, the more effort state put to finding illegal migrants, the more illegal migrants there are. Similarly, because illegality is produced by law, the more laws there are constraining migration, the more categories of people exist who are in breach of these laws. This process is very much visible in the reaction of the European Union to migration. In response to what Den Haayer, Riepma, Spijkerboer diagnosed as a serious structural problems of the common European asylum system, such as lack of genuine EU burden-sharing mechanisms, lack of a level playing field with regard to legal standards of protection, reliance of coercion or unrealistic expectations regarding the role of borders, the measures taken by the EU are only reproducing these problems as they are based, and I quote, on an intensification of the prohibition of the cross-border movement of refugees combined with neglect of the position of refugee in the region. End of quote. It is therefore highly unlikely that these responses will bring about any meaningful changes in the position of migrants and refugees in the EU. They instead intensify the fragmentation I have already mentioned. I would like to use the EU-Turkey agreement as an example. It constitutes one of the three responses to the increased numbers of asylum seekers arriving in the EU in 2015 in results of the war in Syria and advancement of ISIS in Iraq. The reform of the common European asylum system that is currently ongoing, the hotspot and burden sharing approach, and the selective admittance of asylum seekers spelled out in the agreement with Turkey. EU started to discuss with Turkey already in autumn 2015, when EU-Turkey action plans has been signed in October 2015. Its aim was, and I quote, to address the current crisis situation in three ways: by addressing the root causes leading to the massive influx of Syrians, B, by supporting Syrians under temporary protection and their host communities in Turkey, and C, by strengthening cooperation to prevent irregular migration flow to the EU. Following that agreement, a EU-Turkey statement was agreed on 18 March 2016. The main premise was to end irregular migration from Turkey to the EU by breaking up, and I quote, the business model of the smugglers and to offer migrants an alternative to putting their lives at risk. The statement has provided that all new irregular migrants crossing from Turkey into Greek islands, as from 20th March 2016, will be returned to Turkey. This will take place in full accordance with EU and international law, in particular in accordance with the relevant international standards and in respect of the principle of non-refoulement. For every Syrian being returned to Turkey from Greek islands, another Syrian will be resettled from Turkey to the EU, taking into account the UN vulnerability criteria. Priority will be given to migrants who have not previously entered or tried to enter the EU irregularly. And finally, Turkey will take all necessary measures to prevent new sea or land routes for illegal migration opening from Turkey to the EU, and will cooperate with neighboring states as well as the EU to this effect. The human rights violation that has taken place after the introduction of the deal, both in Greece and in Turkey, not mentioning the coup in Turkey that has thwarted the opposition and seriously limited democracy, have been documented by various organizations such as Amnesty International, ECRE, Jesuit Refugee Service, and many others. They are well known, and I will not be mentioning them here. Let me, however, reflect on the refugee subjectivity supported by these measures. As you can see, the provisions of the statement fit really well with the fragmented refugee subjectivity that I have discussed earlier in this talk. Let's have a closer look. And you have a quote from the press release after the statement has been agreed. First, all new irregular migrants crossing from Turkey into Greek islands as from 20th March 2016 will be returned to Turkey. Priority will be given to migrants who have not previously entered or tried to enter the EU irregularly. This statement supports my claim that irregularity is linked with lack of basis for refugee status and is used as an argument in treating all those asylum seekers arriving irregularly into bogus asylum seekers. The statement targets all irregular migrants, despite the fact that it has become even more difficult to access the EU territory as well as the territory of countries neighboring Syria. 2. For every Syrian being returned to Turkey from Greek islands, another Syrian will be resettled from Turkey to the EU, taking into account the UN vulnerability criteria. This statement supports the understanding that genuine refugee is the vulnerable person. Without agency, one doesn't take the matters in their own hands and does not attempt to arrive in the EU oneself, but patiently waits for resettlement, the goodwill, or humanitarianism of the Western states. Finally, these measures have been implemented not before, but actually after the numbers of refugee arrivals in Europe has dropped exponentially. As you see from the graph, there was no need for the EU-Turkey deal when we look from the perspective of the refugee arrivals numbers. This only corresponds, and this is, I forgot to put the reference, this is one of the European Commission statements regarding the implementation of EU-Turkey statement. So this only corresponds with the claim I have been presenting here that we do not deal with refugee crisis, but rather with the narrative of crisis deriving from the crisis of values. So what I have intended to show you today is that the European Union and its member states are indeed stuck in the twilight zone, the space in between, as has been also well spelled out in the title of today's conference, Migration and Refugee Crisis, the EU and its member states, between obligations, self-interest and goodwill. In this in-between space, the fragmented refugee subject, neither good or bad, but indeed the ugly, propels our actions. It sets the course for the political decision-making, contributing to strengthening of national sovereignty. Catherine Daverney claimed in her recent book, published in 2016, that the EU is an empire with migration as its core. I think the EU might be losing to nation states, which keep the fragmented refugee subject as a main reference for getting into strength. Thank you so much.
So the idea of this session that I'm responsible for as a moderator is to have something that we can call a roundtable debate. And the title of this roundtable debate is, as we have in our programs, Migration and Refugee Crisis in the EU in the Global Context, State of Affairs and Future Perspectives. We have more or less 45-50 minutes, and I invited to this session representatives of different international stakeholders involved to different extent in dealing with migration, refugee and asylum issues. So once again, I would like to officially introduce my guests. I would like to start with Ms. Isabella Cooper, that represents today the European Border and Coast Guard Agency, well known as Frontex. Then we have Ms. Maria Pamuła from United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, representation in Poland. Maria is followed by Dr. Timothy Cooper from second key EU institution for our topic, the European Asylum Support Office. And finally, we have the representative of our honorary patron, Mr. Sebastian Ryś from European Commission representation in Poland. The idea is as it follows. I asked in advance my dear guests to prepare a short speech concerning the topic of our roundtable debate. So each of them will elaborate on this current state of affairs in the field of migration and asylum issues, and then about the future perspectives. Some of them will use PowerPoint presentations, but it was option, it was not compulsory. And after these 4 short speeches, we are supposed to gather some questions, I hope from the audience, not from myself. So please take notes, listen carefully, and if you are inspired or want something in more detailed way, you are free to ask questions after the intervention. So Isabella, the floor is yours, please.
All right. The PowerPoints weren't necessary, in fact. I prepared some photos, rather, to illustrate my speech. I will start, in order to talk about Frontex and about the challenges my agency is facing, I will go back to the events of 2015, which you all remember was the year of the highest migratory pressure. Over 1 million people, both migrants and refugees, it's important to stress here because these flows were mixed, crossed the external borders of the EU. There were about 860,000 people who arrived on small dinghies from Turkey to 5 small Greek islands, and about 160,000 who came mainly from Libya to Italy. They were coming on tiny, overcrowded boats. The one that we see here is a typical one. It's an 8 to 10 meter long rubber dinghy on which the smugglers operating in Libya pack up to 170 people. 10 meters, 8 to 10 meters is what, 2 cars parked one after another. Imagine taking off the roof and putting so many people, the vast majority of whom is not wearing life jacket. In fact, in 2015, 3,000 people died when coming. I will show you, I know I'm pressed for time, but these are the images we very often witness during our search and rescue operations. This is a boat coming from Tunisia, carrying 300 people. Luckily, none of them died, which was a miracle. These boats are so overcrowded that if they hit a wave laterally, people just end up in the sea. Keep in mind that most of the people crossing the sea, be it Aegean or the Mediterranean, have never seen the sea before in their life. So these are really dramatic situations. Europol estimates that in 2015, the smugglers operating in Libya and Turkey made between 4 to 6 billion euros in profit. And certainly these profits did not go to funding of schools or economic development in the countries of origin of the migrants. We are all familiar also with these images. These are people, tens of thousands of people who initially entered Greek islands, then ended up crossing Macedonia, Serbia, towards the European Union. Of course, the these events had affected politics, discussions over security, finance, and fostered really a much wider debate about the European identity and the raison d'être of Schengen institution. It became very clear that the external borders of the EU are only as strong as their weakest link. Several countries of the European Union, there were 4 of them that built fences with barbed wire along their borders with their neighbors. And of course, the debate in the media across Europe were all about, does the European Union, is it going to hold, what is it going to do, and what kind of reaction it would have. These are the borders of the Schengen borders as we know them now. This is my favorite one, the one with the chicken, which represents which is not permanently there. I've been assured by the photographer. The border between Belgium and the Netherlands. So Schengen borders are all about, or Schengen acquis is all about the fact that the internal border control has been removed, which of course created the need to strengthen external border controls at the borders. So that means that Germany no longer has its border with Poland, but the German land border has moved all the way to the Polish-Ukrainian border. Its sea border has moved all the way to Lesbos, to Samos, to Lampedusa, to the Canary Islands. I will go on a bit more, showing you more images. This is the border between Germany and Austria. And this is the border as it is now between between Germany and the Czech Republic. This is the border where I hope some of those present here still remember there was an Iron Curtain. Similarly between Germany and Poland. So these borders have become symbolic, but the events of 2015 really fostered those discussions, or does it still make sense? Was it the end? And of course the eyes, these rather anxious ones, were all directed towards the European Union, which actually was expected to deliver a strategic document or propose a strategic approach to how to deal with the situation. And this is Commissioner Dimitris Avramopoulos. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, Greek Commissioner for Justice and Home Affairs, who in May 2015 tabled on behalf of the Commission European Agenda for Migration, which is a very sound document. It's a very comprehensive document of how the European Union was supposed to deal with that. And basically, this comprehensive document took a very global approach, which stressed the need to stabilize the countries of origin, because migration happens because, or refugee crisis happens because there are wars in the countries of origin of the refugees. The need to provide economic development assistance to the countries, to the poorest countries from which the so-called economic migrants leave. The need to make international arrangements with countries of transit and origin of the migrants, and also to dismantle the people smuggling networks, as well as to strengthen mandates of 3 European agencies which are involved in migration or refugee management, as well as security aspects, namely my agency, Frontex, European Asylum Support Office, represented here by Tim Cooper, and to strengthen the mandate also of Europol, which is the agency coordinating the efforts of European police when it comes to cross-border organized crime. I will quickly just go through the 4 targets or aims, objectives of which were indicated to these 3 agencies. One was, of course, increased border surveillance to make sure that nobody enters the territory of the EU undetected, search and rescue for obvious reasons, identification registration of 100% of those entering the EU. This was a huge problem. A country like Greece, counting 11 million people with a proportionately smaller number of border police and coast guards, was simply unable to register and identify 860,000 people coming. And certainly it wasn't only about registration, it was also about processing of asylum cases. Investigation support when it comes to dismantling of smuggling networks. This is a task that my agency has been given an increased role in after the events of 2015, and also to strengthen the capacity of the individual member states when it comes to returning of those who are not eligible to remain on the territory of the EU. So failed asylum seekers, and also those who did not apply for asylum, who simply do not have, who are deemed by the national judges as not having the right to remain on the territory of the EU. Hotspots, I'm sure some of them have heard about this. This is also part of of the proposal of the Commission. It was about assisting the Italian and the Greek authorities in identification and registration, intelligence collections, and returns and readmissions. These are the hotspots that were set up and currently operating in Greece and in Italy. These are some of the images. For Frontex, the challenge was huge. So these very scary eyes that I showed you before that were directed towards the European Commission 10 minutes after the Commissioner announced it were immediately directed to Frontex, sort of, what have you delivered? And we had to dispatch additional about 1,000 officers to Greece and Italy to assist them in processing and registration of migrants, assisting them with search and rescue, assisting them with all the areas that I described before. Certainly in terms of what changed for us was that there were a lot of the natural difficulties that stem from our mandate became apparent after the events of 2015. One was the fact that the contribution to Frontex operations, you should know that Frontex does not, our role is, if we were to summarize it in one word, is to provide technical assistance to those countries of the EU that face increased challenges at their borders, be it migration or other challenges. In 2015, we did have a significant operations in Italy and Greece, but they were simply insufficient to help these authorities deal with the situation. Our executive director launched a call for the EU member states to deploy 700 additional officers immediately, and we simply couldn't get this number from the member states because they were facing challenges in their homes. But the image that I showed you before about Schengen being as strong as its weakest link, it was really about being able to take full control of that area surrounding the bar. And we eventually managed to do this. But the events of 2015 made the European Commission, Parliament, and the Council ultimately to change our regulation. And now we can, I will just mention 3 elements that are very important in terms of the future activities that we will engage and that we are currently engaging. One is the fact that now we can count on a pool of 1,500 additional officers, which each member state is obliged to provide to Frontex in case of an urgent and unforeseen circumstances. And this is based on quotas, based on the size of the country. The second one is the fact that Frontex can now process personal data, which allows us to be more effective in fight against cross-border crime and including terrorism and foreign fighters. So we can collect intelligence, which includes personal data. We can pass this intelligence then to the national police authorities and to Europol. Last but not least is the enhanced role in returns. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have about this. And we also conduct vulnerability assessment, which is basically a series of tests to assess the preparedness and the capacity of the individual member states that have an external border to cope with challenging situations at their borders. I am told I have to finish, so I will just finish here. But I can talk about all these issues, you see. But maybe last element, yes, we do have a much stronger mandate and we do have a much higher budget than we did before. But it's important to stress that border control is not the solution. It's not the panacea for management of the flows. It's certainly not a panacea to manage the people smuggling networks that are profiting so highly. So we have to look at the solution to this situation from a much more global perspective, and the 5 elements of this are on this screen. Yeah, so stabilizations of countries of origin, eliminating the root causes of migration, fight against smuggling networks, and opening up of legal channels which would allow the refugees to apply for asylum without having to put themselves in the hands of the smugglers and without financing these networks. But of course, in order to do that, you need the commitment of all EU member states. And this is, of course, a rather challenging situation. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank Marta for inviting me for such a great conference and for such an important discussion. I was told that I have 10 minutes, not more, so I'll try to stick to the time given. I would like to go more globally than EU, and I would just like to present to you a little bit broader picture. To summarize, as a UN agency and as a UN agency that's dedicated to work for refugees or provide responses for refugees, we are more like a response agency than and a protection-oriented agency than the organization that is working on addressing root causes. Therefore, the majority of our activities focus on finding the solutions and assisting the governments to address the needs of refugees and persons in need of international protection. I'll just skip that to be faster. When it comes to global picture, this data is unfortunately only for 2016. The one coming for 2017 will be released in June this year. We have some delays in collecting the data. All the data presented here is our UNHCR data. But to talk about the global picture, I think that the picture from 2017 will not be much different than 2016, when we had 65.6 million of forcibly displaced persons around the globe. And it's a quite heavy number. That's the biggest number we've observed in years. And just to say, UNHCR was created for 3 years to resolve the refugee problems within the 3 years in 50s. And now, 60 couple of years later, we're still here, and the number of persons in need of our protection or our assistance is growing and growing every year. We have 22.5 million people who were refugees by the end of 2016, including 5.3 Palestinians under UNRWA mandate. We have more than 40 million internally displaced persons, so persons who are not entitled to receive the refugee status because they have not left their countries of origin, but they are still in need of protection and support, with a quite big number of over 2 million right close to Polish border in Ukraine. 2.1 million of asylum seekers, that's quite a significant number too, so persons still waiting for the decision on their asylum cases. When we look at the numbers, 2016 was a really, I don't want to say, okay, that's the wrong word I wanted to use, but that's the year that we've seen the major influx in the refugee numbers. That's 10.3 million newly displaced. So within 1 year, we've observed 10 million persons being forced to flee their homes, their countries of origin. That gives us 20 new displacement every minute. So while I'm talking, you can see how many persons just were forced to flee their houses. To see the main bulk, it's a 55% come only from 3 countries, which is Syrian Arab Republic, Afghanistan, and what was new in 2016, the youngest democracy of the world, South Sudan, which is very sad from our perspective. The countries that host most of the refugees, you have on the screen also Turkey, Pakistan, Lebanon, Islamic Republic of Iran, Uganda, and Ethiopia. As you can see, no European countries here, so it also gives us a picture about the scale of the problem when we look outside our small box of EU member states. When it comes to the situation in Europe, this is a small commercial because we are very proud of this website. If you want to have the latest data, this website is updated on daily basis. So it's data.unhcr.org, and it's really, you can get the latest information about the persons who are trying to cross or who are crossing Mediterranean Sea to enter European Union countries. So that's basically, I did it a couple of 2 or 3 days ago. So it's basically the data from this week. 12,640 persons who reached European shores this year already. We've been hearing about the EU-Turkey deal already. So just to say, yes, it probably didn't change the numbers because the numbers were going down anyway, but it definitely changed the bulk of it changes the nationalities that are reaching the European shores right now. Before EU-Turkey deal, with the majority, I mean, the top one is the same, it's Syrian Arab Republic, but the majority of persons who were reaching Europe before EU-Turkey deal, those were Middle East countries. Now we observe, because also of a different routes from African shores to Italy, we observe more and more African nationals coming from various states, being Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, Morocco, and others. What are the perspectives? That's a very difficult question, and for sure not for 10-minute speech. But just to brief you very quickly on what's going on a global level. We have had the New York Declaration in September 2016, there where countries gathered to address the needs of the countries with a protracted refugee situation and those who are facing those who are hosting large number of refugees. So on 19 September 2016, the New York Declaration was signed by the countries attending the summit in New York, the UN conference, and then including also Polish president who also signed the New York Declaration, just in brackets. But this New York Declaration gave us the basics to discuss the concrete actions, and that's what happened. The New York Declaration entitled UNHCR to work on a so-called CRRF. We are very good in acronyms and we love them. CRRF, it's a comprehensive refugee response framework. It's a kind of a tool that it's being developed right now. It started with the negotiations and with the consultations with relevant stakeholders. Then 13 countries were selected to do a kind of a test ride and to work on the solutions and to check if the solutions proposed are working. And now we are getting to the stage of developing, of assessing those solutions that were offered and negotiating with the states concrete actions. So, so to say, there is work going on a so-called global compact on refugees, which is almost finalized. Now the countries are working on a so-called roadmap for the global compact on refugees, not to mix because there is also a global compact on migration. That's a slightly different thing. But the latest document comes from, I think, 9th of March, where countries are already decided on the concrete actions. Yes, it's 9th March 2018. And it is expected that countries would agree by the end of this year on very concrete proposed solutions to address the refugee problems worldwide, not only within the European Union or developed countries, but worldwide. It's a very comprehensive document. It just gives very, very concrete actions that need to be taken in various areas, saying it be education, jobs and livelihood, health, gender, accommodation, and so on and so on. The next step would be 2019, where is expected the first global summit on refugees to take place. And during this first global summit on refugees, countries, partners, institutions, NGOs will make pledges. And they will pledge what concrete offers they have for refugees and for the solutions globally, but also locally. So there's also the time for our consultations, local consultations coming very soon, to discuss with our counterparts what can they offer to resolve the refugee problems. And the next step is this 2019 Global Summit. It will be held every 3 years, so this will be the occasion to check on the progress and to revise and to make additional pledges. Also this year, UNHCR wishes to complete the kind of a indicator scheme that will be used to measure the progress of the concrete actions that were proposed. When we come to, just one last sentence. Oh, I'm fine. That's great. When we come, this is what's happening locally, globally. But when we come to the European Union and the responses for the refugees coming here or for the asylum seekers coming here, we have worked on a document which is called Better Protecting Refugees in the EU and globally, that we present a couple of our ideas on how to address the asylum issues in Europe, and I have to say that I looked with a pleasure for the Frontex presentation, and because some of the points match our points, like the creating alternative pathways and the creating legal solutions for asylum seekers to enter Europe, so they don't have to use the smugglers network and the route through the Mediterranean or other illegal possibilities of crossing the borders. So yes, the document is available on our website, also in Polish language. If somebody is interested, I may share it with you with pleasure. The information about the Global Compact and its current works are also on our UNHCR.org website. So I'll be happy to answer any questions if there are. Thank you very much.
It works. Hello, good morning. My name's Tim Cooper. I'm from the European Asylum Support Office. It's good to come after UNHCR because you had the global perspective. It really puts the numbers we are dealing with in Europe in perspective. We tend to think in Europe that we're dealing with a massive crisis, but actually as a proportion of the overall global numbers, though it is unprecedented since the Second World War, it's not all that big when you think about it globally. I'll just start by giving you an update on the asylum situation in Europe. When I say in Europe, I actually mean Europe. We call it EU plus because we also deal with Norway and Switzerland. So all of the figures that you see involve the numbers from Norway and Switzerland too. Here you can see quite clearly when the crisis happened, and it was largely a crisis of asylum. But I would caution you that we should be very clear that we don't always talk about the same groups. So when Isabella talks about arrivals, that does not necessarily mean that all of the people arriving are asylum seekers, and it doesn't mean that all asylum seekers are people who arrive by illegally crossing a border. They can be quite separate groups. However, during the crisis, so at the end of 2015, a big peak there when we were having something like 180,000 asylum seekers per month, indeed, almost everybody who was arriving illegally, making an illegal border crossing, to use Frontex terminology, but they were also, almost all of them, asylum seekers. So the two groups were actually the same during the crisis. But since then and before then, they can be quite different groups. So we need to be clear when we talk about what we're talking when we're talking about asylum compared to people arriving in an irregular manner at the external borders of the EU. So you can see also from this line graph at the top that now in the last year, 2017, basically we've gone back down to a level which was last seen in 2014. So we've gone back to sort of pre-crisis levels. And we're now running at about 60 or 70,000 applications for asylum made per month in the whole of the EU+. Here again, a word of caution, when I talk about applications, I mean the actual application. I'm not talking about the people who are applying. So there can be people who make more than one application. Okay, so these numbers are somewhat inflated if you're thinking about the number of people, the actual asylum seekers making the applications. Talking about just this year, so far this year, and we have data until the 18th of March, so quite recent, we've had about 125,000 applications for asylum. That's more or less 10 or 11,000 per week. So the level is still relatively constant, so very similar to what it was last year. A third of all of the applications were from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, or Nigeria. That's quite different to during the crisis when 2/3 of all of the applications were made were just from three countries, Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. So in recent months and last year, the composition of the flow of asylum seekers is really changing and it's expanding. So there are many more countries producing asylum seekers who then come and apply in Europe. The European member states are keeping up with the flow quite well. They are making about 60,000 decisions per month. And now we're at the level where only about a third of all of the decisions made are positive. So 2/3 of the decisions which are being made currently result in a negative decision. So the person is denied asylum. Whereas during the crisis, when, as I said, almost all of those arriving were Syrians, Iraqis and Afghanis, the recognition rate went up to something like 60%. But now we're back down to about a third. And final fact, overall, we are also making progress in reducing the backlog. Of course, with millions of people arriving in quite a short space of time, there was a big backlog of cases, well over 1 million in 2016. Now that number has been reduced to about 500,000. Here you can see, by looking at the big circles, those are the major flows to the European Union. At the bottom you have the top 30 countries of origin, and on the side you have all of the member states. I won't go into this in detail, but just suffice it to say you can see most, the member states taking most applications were France, Germany, Greece, Italy, and to some extent the United Kingdom, and the largest numbers of applications were being made by Syrians, Nigerians, Iraqis and Afghanis, as I said before. If we look at the beginning of this year, this is basically the same thing but shown in a different way. It depends on your brain which one you understand best. I happen to like this one best. You can see what proportion of the overall flow Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan and Nigeria represent. I said 1 in 3, but if you look at the rest of the donut, you can see just how many other countries there are, and really they're from all over the world. So there's plenty from Africa, there's plenty from the rest of Asia, there's even Venezuela there now. So it really has diversified the flow over the past year. And as you can see from the bottom right donut, only about 5 or 6 member states are dealing with well over 2/3 of all of the asylum applications being made in the EU. Of course, not all asylum seekers are equal. There are different recognition rates for each country of origin. So you can see from this graph the big circles. On the left we have the recognition rate. So the top right circle there is up at the level of 100%. And that's for Syrians. So basically, almost every Syrian who applies is given asylum. If you look at the bottom left of the graph, you can see a big circle down there. Those are Afghans, and you can see that the recognition rate is much lower, around about 20%, 25% on average. And there are other countries with different recognition rates in between. The length of the line is how different the recognition rate is in each member state. So with complicated countries like Afghanistan, you will have a long line because there will be some member states giving high recognition rates and some giving low recognition rates for the same country of origin. But where the line is very short, so for instance with Albania, there, the red color, you can see that almost all member states agree that the recognition rate for Albanians is very low, below 10%. That can be for various reasons. It can be different decision practices, but it can also be that they have different types of Albanians or different types of Syrians applying in certain member states. This is just to represent the number of pending cases which are remaining now in the EU. The lighter color at the bottom is the proportion of pending cases which have been waiting for a decision for longer than 6 months. And that is the legal limit, according to EU law, that all asylum applications should get a decision before 6 months. But as you can see from this graph, around about half of them at the moment are not. So that's more or less the situation in the EU plus as regards asylum. What do we do? What does EASO do? Basically, we do 3 things. We do information and analysis, so we gather these statistics and we show them at conferences like this. The stuff is also available, of course, on our website. We do training and we do a number of investigations into best practices, into standards, etc., and we publish those on our website too. And of course, like Frontex, we do operations, usually in hotspots. In regard to the operations, currently we're present in Greece and Italy, of course, in the hotspots, but also in the capitals. And we're also, in a much smaller way, present in Bulgaria and Cyprus, where we work on things like reception and on backlog management. In the hotspots in Italy and Greece, we were very much concerned with the relocation scheme, which I'm sure some of you have heard of and which was for a while rather contentious. That's now all finished. And we are there now dealing rather with, in Greece, admissibility procedures on the islands, and in Italy with registration, helping the Italians register applicants for asylum. Those are the figures for relocation. 33,000 relocated overall, and there's only about 1,000 or 2,000 people left to be relocated to other member states before the scheme really comes to an end. As Isabella was saying, we too have had our, there's been a proposal by the Commission to radically revise our regulation in order to expand our mandate and strengthen our work. So we too are now waiting for that to be passed and to come into force. And when that happens, we will have expanded current roles, but we will also have new tasks. The major new tasks that we will have will be, in particular, monitoring member states' asylum systems to see, if they're working as they should. Basically, we will be monitoring each member state every 5 years, very much in depth. We're currently planning now how we will do that. We will be much more involved in producing operational standards that member states need to live up to in various aspects of the asylum system. We will be providing guidance on how member states should deal with asylum seekers from basically every country of origin and every safe third country. We will also have emergency pools of asylum experts from member states. So our pool is smaller, it's only 500 people, but those will be immediately deployable should there be a crisis in the future. And we are waiting to see if the proposed permanent relocation scheme under Dublin is actually passed, it goes into law, and if it does, then we will be charged with managing it. This is currently where the SEAS is at in terms of, as you know, the Common European Asylum System consists of these pieces of legislation. All of them have been proposed for changes, major changes by the Commission. This is more or less where we're at. It may be that I'm a little bit behind the times, but more or less where we are here. As you can see, we put our own regulation at the top of the list, of course. So the proposed EU Agency for Asylum, we won't be EASO anymore, we will be the EU Agency for Asylum, is up there in trilogue, and we're hoping that it will be adopted towards the end of June. But unfortunately now, apparently, this is going to be linked to progress on the Dublin proposal, which is much more contentious, and therefore we are unsure as to whether this will actually happen by June or not, and whether we will be waiting several months more. That's it. If you have any questions on either the situation or the development of EASO, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Okay, I don't know what, it works. So first of all, I would like to express gratitude to the Warsaw School of Economics for organizing this event, the second edition of EU Eumigro conference. And it's fantastic that the school asked us for our patronage, and we obviously granted it. Well, I feel that all the relevant data was already delivered, so I'm in a sort of vacuum. Nevertheless, just a few short opening remarks regarding the European Union and what it is, because the EU and its activities or inactivity was heavily referred to by previous speakers. In general, I would like to appeal to not treat the European Union as something different than the sum of its member states, because European Union equals member states. All decisions reached at the level of the Union are agreed in the European Union Council, and this political stimulus is also always given by the European Council. So it's not like the European Union is a sort of omnipotent behemoth looming over Europe and imposing this or that proposal without consent of its member states. So any decision taken at the European level is previously heavily discussed by its member states, and all these member states needs to agree that we going to do that or this. So just to briefly open the what was done, what the European Union tasked itself in 2015 and previously when the migration crisis was growing. Certainly the European Commission and all other relevant European institutions didn't task itself with undoing the crisis, because it's impossible. The crisis, I do believe it's a sort of new reality we live in. The European Commission tasked itself with alleviating the situation first of all in Greece and Italy. That is to some degree a reason why the Commission proposed aforementioned European agenda on migration. It consists several of crucial elements, and only one heavily discussed, especially in Poland, was relocation and resettlement schemes, which were also agreed on by all European member states in July and September 2015. As we all know, not every European member state, except that it agreed on following the schemes, decided to follow them afterwards. Poland, the Czech Republic and Hungary were among those countries which the European Commission had to refer to the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg, and it happened in December for not fulfilling its legally binding obligation to participate in relocation scheme. The scope of challenge in the context of relocation for these countries wasn't that tremendous, because as it was mentioned previously by Ms. Pamua in her presentation about the real picture of the migration crisis, the accepting of 7,000 refugee seekers is not a challenge at all when compared to numbers of refugee seekers staying currently in Lebanon, for example. Another point regarding the divisions in Europe. President Juncker always appealed to not treat Europe as Western Europe or Eastern Europe, to not create these divisions. Political developments in the European Union proved that any member state, regardless whether it joined the European community in the 50s or in 2004, is not immune to populism. We have strong populist movements in Germany, in Italy, and I do not believe that those countries were suddenly transferred from Western Europe to Eastern Europe. So populism is present in every European country, and in every European member state there are movements which perceive certain European action like relocation or resettlement as highly controversial. Where we are right now, the European Commission believes that it managed, in cooperation with its member states, with the European Union member states and other institutions, to alleviate the severity of the crisis. As I said, it's impossible to undo the crisis because there is no any entity in the world which could undo the climate change or bring to an end every military conflict, which is a pushing factor for migrants to seek refuge in the European Union. All these numbers that were presented here clearly say that the various European activities managed to bring down those huge numbers from 800,000 of new arrivals in Greece in 2015 to 34,000 in 2017. It's difficult to verify whether without the EU-Turkey statement that number wouldn't go up again, because we have the statement adopted and in action since 2016. From our perspective, it proved to be a solid element of that solution. But naturally, there are other elements of European response which were already mentioned in the European agenda on migration, and they are also linked to that what happened in relations with Turkey. This is cooperation with third countries, with neighboring countries, with neighboring geographical regions. Cooperation with Africa, which was it didn't start in Valletta in 2015, but the Valletta summit was important step into setting up the European Trust Fund for Africa and other financial vehicles which were set up in order to support better governance in African countries to increase investments in these countries, and one of these vehicles could be is the European External Investment Fund. So there is a lot of things going on in order to alleviate the migratory pressure on the European Union, and this is a task which is ahead of the European Commission and other European institutions. As the rest of the speakers, I'm obviously open to answer any questions you might have.
So thank you very much for all the speeches. Because we are a bit in a hurry, but still I think that the most important part is the one concerning the questions from the audience. I would like to offer like 5-6 minutes for 2-3 questions, brief ones from the audience concerning representatives of 4 institutions we have today. Are there any questions? Okay. Mogę poprosić? Włącz mikrofon, dobrze? Okay. So please.
Grzegorz Lindenberg, I have a question to both Ms. Pamuła and Mr. Rysz concerning practical steps that either UNHCR or European Commission did to provide proper contribution of Saudi Arabia and other rich Arab countries into sheltering and financing Syrian refugees in 2015-2016. As far as I know, the financial contribution of these countries was almost zero, despite the fact that Saudi Arabia had state reserves of $750 billion and 3 million places in air-conditioned tents prepared for Hajj pilgrims available. Saudi Arabia is located 80 kilometers from Syria, a neighbors Jordan that houses 500,000 Syrian refugees. So were there any practical steps that the Commission and the UN organization did to make sure that these countries take Syrian refugees and pay for Syrian and other refugees? Thank you.
Any other questions from the audience? Okay. Professor Paweł Kaczmarczyk, Center of Migration Research, University of Warsaw, please.
In fact, I have 2 questions.
Okay, please.
The first one is to representatives of European Union, particularly to Ms. Cooper, because you showed to us those shocking pictures from 2015 mainly, but my question is what about outcomes of recent actions taken by European agencies, including also Frontex? Because we know that the death toll is very high, death rate is in fact much higher than it was below. So how you comment also the situation in Libya, the treatment of asylum seekers there, and the general assessment? What would be a
Okay, so thank you very much, and I think that here we will stop with the questions. So could you please refer to the questions from the audience in a turn you prefer? Briefly, and then we will invite all of you for a short coffee break. So please, the floor is yours, so it's up to you to decide.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me? I've got strong. The search and rescue is a priority. I mean, if you look at the situation, throughout the years in 2015 and 16 and 17, the death toll remains high. But it's not higher because we have to look at the proportion of people arriving and people departing. I do not remember off the top of my head. In 2015, I believe it was 5,000. In the following year, 3,500. In 2016, I cannot remember off the top of my head the numbers for 2000.
Maybe you want to join us here.
Yeah. The Mediterranean Sea is 2.5 million square kilometers large. It is impossible to guarantee full safety of the sea. There is no amount of vessels that would be sufficient to provide full safety. And this is why it is, if you look at the fact that the smugglers operating in Libya put people on board, 170 people on board of a 10-meter long dinghy, where none of the migrants are given a life jacket. It takes seconds for a tragedy to occur. So what needs to be done is we need to fight the smuggling networks and prevent them from putting people in dangerous situations. And this is why what the European Commission is suggesting is to open legal channels which would allow the refugees to apply for asylum without having to rely on dangerous forms of transportations, without them having to finance these criminal networks, is really a priority. But here the solution clearly requires the commitment of the member states who would be willing to accept resettled refugees. And this is something that obviously me representing an operational agency is nothing I can really say beyond what I just said. It does require political commitment. In terms of saving lives, since the new regulation that I spoke about now explicitly mentions the role of Frontex in search and rescue operations. We do have this part explicitly mentioned in our mandate, but search and rescue, independently of whether it is part of your mandate or not, is an obligation of whoever is out at sea, whether it's a Coast Guard vessel, military vessel, private yacht, or a ferry boat. Search and rescue operations are coordinated by the national authorities which are responsible for a certain area of search and rescue waters, and it's them that take the decision who should go and rescue these people. Last year, vessels deployed by Frontex contributed to the rescue of 35,000 lives. And this is something we take extremely seriously and that we will take extremely seriously. So we cooperate with national authorities. But again, it is not just like what I said about border control. What happens at the border are the dramatic symptoms of a much bigger problem which has to be addressed at the root.
Addressing first of the questions regarding the Saudi Arabia and the Middle East, I have to admit I'm not the expert on the Middle East, so excuse my ignorance. But I've just checked because I had it somewhere on my email, and in fact, in October last year, UNHCR has signed an agreement with Saudi Arabia on assisting refugees and persons in need of protection. And on increased cooperation, so that the first sign would be the assistance of more than 500,000 Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh that would be supported by Saudi Arabia. Besides that, as according to the numbers I got, Saudi Arabia at the current moment are hosting more than 500,000 Yemeni refugees, 260,000 Syrian refugees, and 300,000 Burmese. There is a question if those are refugees or not, because the Saudi Arabia are not treating them as refugees per se, according to Geneva Convention. They are treating them as the persons in a particular vulnerable situation, but not call them refugees. That's the issue. But I understand that the cooperation agreement has been signed recently, and that will be trying also to pursue the change of the attitude in that part of the world towards assisting refugees. When it comes to the global compact, I think it's for the more clever minds than mine to decide. And yes, do we need 2 global compacts? I think that yes and no. I mean, the migration is an overall issue, and the refugees are migrants too. I mean, forced migrants. But they're in a particular vulnerable situation that they need much more support and much more assistance to become self-reliant, I believe. And then the assistance toward refugees, it should be somehow more targeted towards better integration solutions, but also better protection solutions. Steering migration is not an easy issue, and I particularly like the phrase mixed migration. It's always mixed migration. You even have refugees who are not, I mean, in my view, 100% refugees. Some of the reasons to fly were at some point maybe I don't know, influenced by the migration factors, like moving from one European country to another to search for a better job or to provide for better education opportunities. But still, those are people who are most vulnerable. And especially those who are in a particular vulnerable, out of the vulnerable. So for example, women with children or unaccompanied minors, they need specific assistance. And I'm very happy that we have 2 global compacts, because that it shows the importance of that group. And I believe that, I hope that it could be implemented in a proper way. Thank you.